time to prepare ourselves for what is coming, for what we must face, even though we're uncertain or unsure of the intensity or the ferocity of the storm. We just know it's coming. And here in the Territory, particularly the wet season, we see those storm clouds gather up and beautiful to look at. But we know that behind those wonderful white fluffy clouds, there's quite a ferocious storm that could unpack itself. And so we don't take it lightly, we prepare ourselves. And for all intents and purposes, God's people living at that time under the domination of the Persian Empire. And so they were feeling pretty good about things that were happening. Their situation seemed to be changing for the good. They had one of their own people as the Queen of Persia. There was a quiet confidence that had sort of sprung up about the future and what possibilities lay before them. Things were improving. The future was looking better. In other words, they could see light at the end of the tunnel. But if they'd looked below the surface, they would have seen trouble was brewing. Trouble was heading their way big time, because some of the changes that are about to be made to the palace personnel would actually bring terror and fear into their hearts in a very short time of space. They remained unaware, if you like, they were blissfully ignorant of just how things were about to become for them as God's people. You know, it's the lull before the storm. It's what you don't see that actually traps you. Then I've got what's called a problematic promotion. And we've seen this happen many times. It doesn't matter whether you're the head of a large corporation or a small business or a leader in a volunteer-based organisation. There'll come a time where you need to promote someone to a position of leadership in that organisation. And if you promote the wrong person, well, there's a whole list of things that can go belly up for you. It not only affect you, but it'll affect other employees or volunteers, and it will affect the company's reputation in the community. And from time to time, we've seen what happens when wrong people are promoted. And they're either promoted through manipulation and deceit. They've used exploitation of others, using unethical methods to hide what they're really like and what their own agenda embraces. But it's interesting, you see the real character come out when they've got the position they desired. Their true character comes out. And that character often embraces a sense of entitlement. It embraces a sense of grandiose, look at me, I've made it, I am somebody. And I've put also a sense of narcissism. It's about me. Look at me and what I've done. I've reached the top of the pile, so to speak. And our text reveals this is exactly what took place with a person called, and it's an interesting name, Haman. What a name. But it's not his fault. That was a name that he was given. But can you imagine, Haman? And he was given this promotion because the king promoted him to be the second most powerful person in the kingdom behind him. And he was put in this position by the king, and little did the people of God know that he was going to cause them so much pain and anguish throughout the empire, because he was a man that was wrongly promoted for the wrong reasons, and he was so full of himself and his own importance, he would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. And that's the wrong sort of person you want in a position of authority and in control of a company. So his promotion was going to be a problem for the Jewish people. They just didn't know it. The account after these things happened. And you might be saying, well, what's that referring to? Well, it's referring to what previously happened at the end of chapter 2. And you remember that Mordecai just happened to be in the right place at the right time, overheard a plot of the two kings' bedchambers. In other words, they were given the position of entrusting, looking after the king's life when he went to bed, and they had plotted to scheme and kill him. And Mordecai got wind of it, and he told the queen, who told the husband, who had it investigated, who had them hanged. Thus ends the story. And we found that Mordecai was recorded in the book of the king's events. Everything that they did, there was a record that was kept. And so usually what happens when somebody has done something like this, the king usually rewards them, a position of authority or money or wealth or something as a reward. But here, Mordecai's forgotten. For the moment, it's recorded, pushed under the rug. But he will be brought forward in another day. He's forgotten right at the moment, but he's going to be remembered. But this is what it means after these things. This is what happened. Oops. The appointment. King Xerxes honoured Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite. He gave him a new rank that was higher than all the important men. So here we have, just in our text, the appointment without song of Haman. Now, at this point in the narrative, we know Esther, we know Mordecai, we know Esther, we know Vashti. What do we know of Haman? Who is he? And why is he recorded? Good question. The fact that we're told that he was the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite. Did you realise there's so much confusion and disagreement over his ancestry? Well, there is. Some say he couldn't be an Agagite because King Saul wiped them all out. Some say the time distance between what was recorded in 1 Samuel 15 and Exodus 17 to the time listed here in Esther makes it impossible for him to be an Agagite. Others just say, look, you got it all wrong. It refers to the province from which he came. However, it fails to take into consideration the antagonism that lies simmering between Haman and Mordecai. It's not something that you can just explain away as being coincidence. The fact it appears in the narrative shows that it's been put here to emphasize the hostility or the underlying tension that existed towards the Jewish people. There's a reason why it was put in here. Now, the Jewish Talmud, which is a Jewish source of extra information, identifies Haman with Memucan. Now that will twig your memory. Who was Memucan? In the first chapter, one of the king's wise counselors who suggested that Vashti had upset the whole kingdom by refusing to obey her husband and so get rid of her. And of course he came to a sticky end himself. But they identify him with Memucan, and he was a direct descendant of Agag, the 16th generation, and therefore he was known as an Amalekite. Now the scriptures, and this is what our authority is, our scriptures give us insights into what the tension existed between the Amalekites and the Jews. And that's where our authority comes from, the scriptures. In 1 Samuel 15, 1-3, we read, Samuel said to Saul, "The Lord sent me to appoint you king over Israel." Now listen to his message. This is what the Lord All-Powerful says. When the Israelites came out of Egypt, the Amalekites tried to stop them from going to Canaan. So I'll punish them. Now go and attack the Amalekites and destroy everything they own as an offering to the Lord. Don't let anything live. Put to death men, women, children, small babies, cattle, sheep, camels and donkeys. Very specific in what they were to do. And then in verses 8-9, he took King Agag of the Amalekites alive, but he killed all of Agag's army with the sword. Saul and the army let who live? They let him live, along with the best sheep, fat cattle and lambs. They let every good animal live because they did not want to destroy them. But when they found an animal that was weak or useless, they killed it. Now, what were the instructions? Kill them all. That was what they were told to do. There was no favoritism. It was just wipe them all out. But what did King Saul do? He didn't wipe them all out. He favoured the king. He failed to follow the Lord's instructions. And Samuel told Saul, because of his disobedience, he would lose the kingdom. We then find out a little bit more. In Exodus 17, verses 8-16, we find at Rephidim, the Amalekites came, fought the Israelites. So Moses said to Joshua, "Choose some men and go and fight the Amalekites. Tomorrow I will stand on top of the hill, holding to the walking stick of God in my hands." Joshua obeyed Moses and went to fight the Amalekites, while Moses, Aaron and Hur went on the top of the hill. As long as Moses held his hands up, the Israelites would win the fight. But when Moses put his hands down, the Amalekites would win. Later, when Moses' arms became tired, the men put up a large rock under him and he sat on it. Then Aaron and Hur held up Moses' hands, Aaron on one side, Hur on the other. They kept his hands steady until the sun went down. So Joshua defeated the Amalekites in this battle. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Write about this battle in a book so people will remember. And be sure to tell Joshua, because I will completely destroy the Amalekites from the earth." Then Moses built an altar and named it, "The Lord is my banner." Moses said, "I lifted my hands toward the Lord's throne. The Lord will fight against the Amalekites forever." So we get a little bit of history about the Amalekites and how this tension between them and the Jewish people had existed for a while. But if we go back even further, we discover that Amalek was a grandson of Esau, and the descendants of Esau were a thorn in the side of the Jewish people. They caused all sorts of problems, and so you can see the tension that goes all the way back until this present time. So that provides us with a little bit of historical background to understand who this Agagite Haman is and his descendants and the tension that existed between them. As one commentator points out, this conflict continued during the time of Saul, when Saul slaughtered most of the Amalekites in 1 Samuel 15. However, he did spare the king and some others as well. And sparing the Amalekites ended up hastening Saul's destruction, since the Amalekites kidnapped David's wives and family, stopping him from aiding Israel and Saul in their time of need. So there was ramifications. And because Saul was only half-hearted in destroying the Amalekites, it's no wonder that those from the Amalekites would hate Saul. Even so, if the Amalekite was an Agite, one who was related to the royal line and possibly to Agag himself. But remember this, Saul was a man of Benjamin, from the tribe of Benjamin, a son of Kish. We need to remember it's beyond coincidence that when we get to the book of Esther, the narrator describes Mordecai as being a man of the tribe of Benjamin, a son of Kish. Can you see? Some people say it's a coincidence, but it's not a coincidence. Here we've got descendants, the two descendants, once again with the tensions lying between them. So it's no wonder that it's been put into this account of Scripture that Haman hated Mordecai intensely. They'd been at odds for centuries. Reminds me of one of those family feuds in America with the McCoys and somebody else, that they lose sight of why they fight. But they just, because it was a McCoy, they had to kill him, and because they were this, they had to kill him, and it just went on and on. Well, this tension continues on. So that's why Haman now, in chapter 3 of Esther, enters our narrative, and he's the villain. And he will bring about the downfall of the Jewish people in his position of power and authority. The affirmation in verse 2, all the royal officers of the king's gate would bow down and kneel before Haman as the king had ordered. Now, I just want us to get a picture of what a narcissist looked like. Now, what do I mean by that? It's a person who really loves themselves. I mean really loves themselves. If they go past a mirror, they have to, oh, hang on a minute. They really have to make sure that everything's right. But it seems that the king, being the number one, and Haman being number two, were part of a mutual admiration club, because the king gave his seal of approval and said that everybody had to bow down. In other words, bow and scrape every time that Haman walked into their presence. Wherever he was, whether he's out shopping, whatever he was doing, if he passed by, you had to bow down and recognize him and his position of authority. I could live with that. You know, hey, bow, hey. This is how he saw himself. And it shows, here's number one and number two in the kingdom with their inflated egos, using their authority to exert over people. Now, if we remember the culture of the Persians of that time, their main aim was to look good. That was their primary aim, look good. Or give the appearance of looking good, and also being in control. Exercise authority, surround yourself with yes people who are on the same page and agree with you, and they're available and they're expendable if something goes wrong. You just get rid of them. Sounds much like today in many respects. The people had no say whether they wanted to bow and scrape to Haman. The king had issued a royal decree and said, this is what you've got to do. You've got to bow down. You've got to recognise him and his position. And there's always got to be one. Always one that says, I'm not going to do it. And the audacity is, Mordecai would not bow down or show him honour. Then the royal officers at the king's gate asked Mordecai, why don't you obey the king's command? So I guess it sticks out when you've got a bloke looking for recognition and everybody else, the king's elite, the upper class, they're all bowing down, acknowledging his position, and the normal people are doing it, and there's one person that says, no, I will not bow the knee. In this case, it was Mordecai. And that meant he was disobeying the king's decree. Now, looking at it, it seems unimaginable that anyone was prepared to defy the king's order. But it seems as though Mordecai wasn't concerned about the consequences. I have no doubt he was aware the king had said, you do it, and it could cost him his life. Add to the fact that some of the king's officials had noticed this act of defiance against Haman, and they had taken it upon themselves to find out why Mordecai didn't toe the line when it came to obeying Haman. Some people would say it was an act of courage, that he was willing to take a stand against Haman. He was making a statement. Others would just say he's plain stupid, because it would have cost him his life. It was unusual for many of the Jewish people to bow in the presence of others to show some respect to a person in his position. So, in other words, they'd grown accustomed to bowing down to certain individuals. But why did Mordecai make such a big deal against not bowing to Haman? And we need to understand the background behind this, because in the Babylonian and Persian cultures, when you bowed before another person, you worshipped that person as if they were a god. And in this case, Xerxes considered himself to be a god. And he gave the order that Haman was to be worshipped by the Persian population as well as being one. So Haman had an inflated opinion of himself, and he expected people to recognise that. But when you put it all together, it seems strange to me that up to this point in time, Mordecai had gone out of his way to keep his identity and keep his ancestry a secret. So far, he'd slipped under the radar, so to speak. Yet here he is, taking a public stand. And when you take a public stand, what do? You draw attention to yourself. Who is this bloke? Why isn't he obeying the king's command? Who does he think he is? Maybe he just reached a point in time where he said enough's enough, and he drew that line in the sand. He wasn't about to compromise anymore, and he refused to bow to anybody other than his God, Jehovah. We see in the next few verses the personal provocation. When you take a stand, it's going to involve some sort of confrontation. Someone who has a high opinion of themselves and demands recognition, and then there's someone who says, I'm not going to comply. I'm not going to do it. And it's hard sometimes for us to understand. And I found an article in a psychology magazine. Now, I'm not into psychology, but occasionally I will read them just to find out what they say. But it helps us to understand some of the reasons why people get angry, why hatred abounds, and why people tend to hold one another in contempt. And they say the difference between hate and anger is that hate involves an individual and not some particular aspect of the individual. In other words, they look at the person, they just hate the person. It's not that the person is bald or is big or small or short or anything like that. You hate someone because of what they are. You get angry at someone because of what they did. So there's a difference between hatred and anger. Anger can be considered more in terms of behaviour. When people are angry at someone, they often have the feeling they can control that other person. Anger essentially is trying to remove the obstacle posed by the other person when you want to reach a goal. You get angry when you want an apology, when you want someone to change their behaviour, and they don't. When there's a repeated anger and nothing changes, contempt rises to the surface. Contempt is a feeling like the other person is not worth your anger. You're still angry. And you're trying to regulate your anger, but you begin to look down on that other person and you put a distance between them. Contempt, if you like, they say, is the cold version of hate. Contempt is about who you are, your nature, and your personality. When you feel contempt, you tend to feel that they are not even worth your attention. In other words, they're beneath you, which I think may make it feel worse than the object of the person's contempt than it does to become the object of hate. With hate, you cannot be indifferent towards a person. You are more engaged because you want to get rid of them, whether that's socially, mentally, or physically. Hate can spread from one generation to another much easier than anger or frustration. It means that not only can people hate others based on somebody else's experiences, but that hate can be as intense as if they had experienced the event themselves. You know, the fights that go from one generation to another, they didn't involve those particular members, but it's as though they were involved, and it goes from generation to generation. This was not the case with anger, which tends to be more intense if you experience the anger causing events firsthand. And we know what that means. If someone cuts you off, you feel that anger firsthand. It's not as though I'm telling you something, you feel it firsthand. In our text, Haman and Mordecai had a personal dislike of each other, and more so when it comes to the revelation, Mordecai is a Jew. The age-old tensions begin to flare up, resurfaces once again between these two. So it's something that's followed all the way through from Esau through the generations. The appeal. And they said this to him every day. When he did not listen to them, they told Haman about it. They wanted to see if Haman would accept Mordecai's behaviour, because Mordecai told them he was Jewish. Now, it's interesting. This wasn't just between Mordecai and Haman. You read here in our text, the court officials decided to make it their business. In other words, they had nothing else to do in the palace, so they decided to go and find out for themselves. In other words, they were nosy. They wanted to find out, hey, what's the story between you two? Why is it you won't do and recognise Haman? And they made it their own, if you like, business. They wanted to know why you're so stubborn and wouldn't bow down, why you wouldn't play the game. And from this we get a sense of the political games and intrigue that surrounded life in the palace. These people were looking for opportunities to integrate themselves with the next rising star, or distance themselves from the next fading star, and they were looking for all kinds of information and gossip that will be useful to promote their own causes. I like the fact that it reminds me it's like a dog with a bone. Have you ever tried to take a bone off a dog that it doesn't want to let go? You know, you can bash it, you can do whatever you like, but if that dog's determined you're not taking that bone, he will not give it up. And this is what these officials were like, a dog with a bone. They were never going to let Mordecai go until he spilled the beans. Tell us, what is the problem that you have with Haman? And so finally they wore him down to the point where he told them, look, I'm Jewish, and I'm not going to listen to anything more that you have to say. That's all he gave them. Now, you know, if you don't get what you want, you're a bit disappointed. And so they decided to take this, just this little bit of information about Mordecai and tell Haman and see, well, let's find out whether Haman's going to do something about this guy Mordecai and whether he'd deal with him. And so we see how this works out in everyday life. the tactics of the enemy are persistent. They don't give up. The pressure every day to make him conformed, they broke him down. They wore him down to get him to compromise his convictions. They were ruthless. They were relentless. And that's what you can expect from your enemies. They'll pursue you and wear you down to the point of least resistance so that you comply to their requirements. That's how it works. That's how the devil has been using that tactic successfully throughout the centuries. But we see the anger. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not bow down to him or honour him, he became very angry. Now, my text says here that he was angry. What it brings out is he was boiling mad inside. He wasn't just angry, he was boiling mad inside at the audacity of this man Mordecai to defy him. And so he's probably asking himself, who does this guy think he is? Doesn't he know who I am? Why won't he reference me? Why won't he do what the king commands? Who is he? He was so full of anger and hate towards Mordecai. It shows us that, well, you have to hate somebody for who they are. He was just a person who said, I'm not going to do what you want. But he hated him. And in this case, Haman found out that Mordecai was Jewish. He was angry with him because he wouldn't do what he was told to do. And you know, when you defy a person who is so full of their self-importance, what can you expect of him? Or her, for that matter? Will you get a stable, rational, thinking person? Not on your Nelly. You see, he could not take it that he had the position and power to control people and tell them, if you don't do what I tell you, you're done. And here's one person that says, not going to do it. I don't recognise your power, don't recognise your authority, not going to do it. And so this man Haman thought he was entitled to all this respect. And he wasn't going to take this lying down. He had to make an example of Mordecai. He had to send a clear message in case somebody else decided to do the same thing. And he wanted to send the message clear, I'm not someone to be messed with. Now, the question is, what do you do with a problem like Mordecai? How do you best handle it and still look good without any mud sticking to you? How do you do that? It had already gone past the point of an apology. That wasn't good enough. He came to the conclusion Mordecai had to go if he was to succeed in his ambitions. He couldn't allow people to have this type of freedom while everybody else in society was doing what they were supposed to, comply or die. This sets up what is to follow. And I can only imagine the tensions running through the palace, people whispering, people gossiping, people waiting to see what's going to happen. Oh, this is going to be great. You could put another soap opera on TV. But they were whispering. And we see, as we finish, the ambition. He thought of himself as too important to try and kill only Mordecai. He had been told who the people of Mordecai were, so he looked for a way to destroy all of Mordecai's people, the Jews, in all of Xerxes' kingdom. Now, isn't it interesting? The second most powerful man in the kingdom is not going to get his hands dirty. No, he's not going to be seen to get his hands dirty here. He has contempt for him. He has contempt for everything that Mordecai stood for. But he had to carefully think through the situation. How is he going to deal with this guy? He wanted his revenge, but he also wanted to appear as being neutral regarding the situation. So he had to come up with a plan that solved his problem with Mordecai while still looking good at the same time. It's a very delicate balancing act. with the information given to him by the other palace officials, Mordecai was Jewish, it gave him the incentive not only to deal with Mordecai, but it gave him the ambition to take care of the whole Jewish nation at the same time. He could make an example of Mordecai, but also he could get rid of those with the same ancestry and teach them a lesson they would never forget. He was going to pay Mordecai back big time, and all those like him for their acts of defiance by destroying them. In other words, remove all the obstacles that stood between him and his ambitions for success. The sad truth is, when you're so prejudiced about someone or some group, when you don't see reason, you do not think about the consequences of what you want to do. All you know and all you're driven by is the desire to do them. You've got to get rid of them. They don't care how it is done. And this was the position of Haman. It didn't matter to him about the difference concerning the people's identities. It didn't matter to him about whether there were people who were actually helping in the Persian kingdom to make it better. He didn't care about that. It doesn't matter if they're innocent men, women, or children. All of the hatred that he had towards Mordecai and the Jewish people were all consumed with this determination to get rid of them. That was his goal. Haman is typical of every enemy who hates those who follow Christ and target those who align themselves as Christians. They seek to destroy everything they hold dear, including their homes and families. Nothing is off limits if it achieves its goal of destruction and removal. And that's the situation we find Mordecai in. This is where the Jewish people are. The storm clouds are gathering on the horizon. Everything had been and appeared good. Things were looking good until this appointment of Haman. And he has a hatred of the Jewish people. He's put in the position where he can do a lot of damage. Little did God's people know what was around the corner, and it wasn't looking good. And sometimes in this world in which we live, there are uncertainties in everyday life. We don't know what the future holds. And we might be sitting here tonight saying, life's good. Don't change it. I'm happy. That can change in a moment, in an instant. And there could be storm clouds on the horizon. And I believe there are storm clouds on the horizon for every person who calls them a Christian in the near future. We're living in a society that tolerates us. We're a minority, not a majority. And we're going to see the same sorts of things happening, if I put it bluntly, with the way our left in society is pushing their own agenda. If you don't agree with the agenda, then you're cancelled, you're wiped out. We haven't got time for you. Anyone who stands up will be cancelled out, will be humiliated publicly. They'll be removed. And we're starting to see that in our society. And interesting about history, there's nothing new under the sun. It's just a different coat of paint. And it prevails again and again. The enemy's tactics are real. But as I said, don't come next week, because we'll be at camp. The week after, we'll pick up and finish the rest of this narrative and see how God is usually taken out of the equation, and in this case, he was. And so there's some interesting surprises ahead for both Haman and for Mordecai as well. As we close, we're going to stand as we sing. I think it's just the first verse.